Things got super interesting this week when two venerated sports journalists, a phrase is not used all that often anymore, but Peter King and Chris Mortensen threw some wrenches into the gears of the pre-draft machinery when Peter King said that the Texans might be considering not drafting a quarterback at number 2 overall, and then Chris Mortensen later in the week suggested that the favorite target for the Carolina Panthers might actually be Bryce Young and not CJ Stroud. So people got all worked up about it. Yours truly included. I'm one of these talking head jackasses. But I do think a lot of people did it prematurely. I'm still convinced the Texans are going to take a quarterback. Got several reasons for that I'll explain along the way. Skip Bayless and Shannon Sharpe basically went off on Nick Caserio like they had already passed on a quarterback at number 2 overall, using a variety of both valid and invalid logic. So I'm going to take you through it and get to why I still think the Texans are going to take a quarterback at number 2 overall. Just to set the stage, this is how it all started. This is Peter King on this is Monday, on his Monday morning quarterback. One of his nuggets: the Houston Texans have to pick a quarterback, or do they? The Texans also pick 12th, and he goes into
Peter King.
What the hell? That got all messed up. Sorry about that. Texans still have to going to pick a quarterback, and we're all operating under the belief that the Texans will pick a quarterback that Carolina leaves for them. I'm 90% on board with that. So Peter King says he's 90% on board with that. I think the Texans are going to go quarterback at 2. So he says it again. But in the last few days, I've heard this about Houston GM Nick Caserio. Very conservative. If he doesn't love a quarterback at 2, he's not going to force it. He'd rather take this year's sure thing, Anderson. The way Detroit took Aiden Hutchinson with a second pick last year. Detroit got rewarded handsomely with a great rookie year from Hutchinson. I have a couple objections to that appraisal of Hutchinson's draft status and also just how awesome a year he had for the Detroit Lions. But also I hesitate to think that not taking a quarterback at number 2 overall is actually the conservative approach. So a lot of speculation there. On Undisputed, or whatever these days, Undisputed, they chose to frame it like this. Tell me if this diverges from what you just read by Peter King, which was a whole lot of ifs and speculation and him saying he's 90% sure the Texans are going to take a quarterback.
Peter King reports the Texans are considering passing on a quarterback with that number 2 overall pick. The idea being instead they'd select Alabama pass rusher Will Anderson with that pick, then take a quarterback with their 12th overall selection. Would this be the right move or the wrong move for the Texans?
Wrong move. Not having a quarterback isn't conservative. It's stupid. Skip, they make it. I can see, Skip, if this was like last year, Kenny Pickett.
All right. So, he makes a good point there. It's as far as now, if it's stupid or not in this particular situation, I personally think it would be for multiple reasons. I don't think CJ Stroud or Bryce Young are the same category of prospect as an Andrew Luck or perhaps a Trevor Lawrence, although I wasn't as high on Trevor Lawrence as other people were. But it is true that, look, it's not like last year's draft where you could make all kinds of reasons not to draft the quarterback high. I agree with Shannon Sharpe in that regard. What I don't get is the way he starts going off on Nick Caserio as if Nick Caserio had already pulled this move. Let's keep watching here. The live stream is a work in process, everybody. Work in progress. There we go.
Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Myles Garrett, Trevor Lawrence, Joe Burrow, all in the draft. You think Myles Garrett going over, and all these guys are coming out, and just as they were rated coming out, you think Myles Garrett going over any one of them?
Okay, so that's two things. One, Skip's face, check it out. That's nice. As far as Myles Garrett going over Trevor Lawrence or Joe Burrow, agreed. That's not going to happen. I personally also don't think that the defensive edge prospects in this class are nearly at the same level of Myles Garrett. So that does set the stage for why it's not likely to happen at all. because quarterbacks are just flat out more valuable than edge rushers. We've seen time and time again with the Houston Texans, whether it's Mario Williams, J.J. Watt, Jadeveon Clowney when he was really at his peak, that none of that supersedes having a good quarterback. And if it's somebody that you think you can win with, yeah, I think you're going to take that quarterback. Caserio is a volume drafter when it comes to quarterbacks, in my opinion. I think he like many GMs these days, know that it's a crapshoot and you've got to take multiple swipes at it before you hit on your quarterback. And that's why they drafted a quarterback in the third round in a year when nobody thought they should draft a quarterback in Davis Mills, because you just got to keep buying those lottery tickets. You got a much better lottery ticket this year at the top of the draft than you would have had last year.
Okay, they have 12, that number 12 pick. So you could hope that Will Levis fell to you, and
What?
that's what you're, yeah.
So you're going to take, remember, okay, Chicago got a GM fired because he had all these guys sitting right there in front of him. He saw Deshaun Watson mop the floor with Trubisky.
He did.
And what did he do?
Yep.
He traded draft picks to move up one spot to draft Mitchell Trubisky.
He did.
Okay, this is where I got angry. And not for any particular Texans reason, except for the sheer logic of it all, because I'm trying to figure out how he's mad in advance at Nick Caserio, and it gets elevated here. He's mad in advance for the Texans not staying at number 2 to draft the quarterback. And the example he brings up is when the Bears traded up for Trubisky. Well, Deshaun Watson was sitting there at number 12. A pick that the Texans currently hold. So I'm furious with Shannon for leading me down that path to where I thought maybe I was going crazy for a little bit. I feel like he lost the plot a little bit there. So yeah, in this scenario, it would actually be better using that logic. Yeah, go ahead and wait for Will Levis. Go ahead and wait for Anthony Richardson. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. Multiple reasons for that. This is where Shannon really starts to go in on Nick Caserio.
Yep.
Sometimes, Skip, they overthink this.
They do.
It's just time is running out on Caceres anyway, Skip. He fired Lovie Smith after 1 year. He fired David Culley after 1 year.
Yep.
And the Texans are 7-26-1 under him. And the quarterback is what? The issue. Ever since the situation that happened with Deshaun, they've been searching for a quarterback.
Yeah, and as J-Rock points out, there's a chance that none of those four are there at number 12. So, again, I don't think that they should wait until number 12. I think that's a ludicrous scenario. It's just you don't bank on in a year where there aren't as many question marks as these guys waiting for somebody to drop to number 4. Right there, just again, I always have to point this out. Shannon Sharpe remains somebody who is angry at the Texans for firing David Culley, angry at the Texans for firing Lovie Smith, yet, as far as I have heard, has never once recommended either of those two guys for a new head coaching job, or for any job for that matter. He points out that quarterback is the issue ever since Deshaun's issues have been resolved. Yeah, you remember that was last offseason. So that was less than a year ago that those issues were resolved. You remember that? And then Nick Caserio actually inherited that. When Nick Caserio came to the Texans, he didn't realize that Deshaun was a massage freak, that he'd gotten 60-plus massages over how many years, and that regardless of what you think about the legality or his innocence or guilt, he was damn sure guilty of really bad judgment. So that wasn't Nick Caserio's issue. It's just simply a matter of, you got to draft the right quarterback, and he hasn't yet passed on a quarterback the way he has. Damn it.
Will Anderson is a phenomenal talent. Phenomenal. But I'm not taking a defender over a top quarterback. Zero. None.
As far as Will Anderson being a can't miss prospect or any defensive end, the biggest issue I have with a lot of the speculation this week is that I don't think that Will Anderson is a good prospect for the Houston Texans defense. And I know a lot of you have heard that from me already, but he's a 6'4", 240-pound dude that does not play with nor match the level of physicality. He doesn't project the level of physicality that D'Amico Ryans talks about all the time. I do think that Tyree Wilson makes a lot more sense. That's why I think even when Lance Zierlein stepped into these waters here. I think he and I are in agreement that if the Texans were to take a defensive player at number 2 overall, it wouldn't be Will Anderson. There's some kind of, it's one of those things going on here where because DeMeco was asked about Will Anderson and DeMeco said nice things about Will Anderson, and perhaps because Will Anderson is from Alabama and DeMeco's from Alabama, that maybe there's just too many dot connectings going on there. I just don't think that that's the guy. That's one of the things that makes me most skeptical about some of these reports is that Peter King and others are linking the Texans to Will Anderson as the guy, which makes me feel like they're just flat out to lunch on it. And it is just speculation more so than anything else.
You know Peter King.
Yes.
I really know Peter King. Mm-hmm. He is really good at what he does. And I know he's just speculating here, but he's doing it with knowledge, with research, with background, with gut feeling on what he's been told about Caserio's conservative nature, that if he doesn't love a quarterback at 2, he's not going to force it. He'd rather take this year's sure thing on the edge.
There's no such thing as a sure thing.
Yeah, okay, so 2 things here. One is Shannon's contradicting himself because he's yelling multiple times here about how there's no such thing as a sure thing as he's talking about these quarterback prospects as being sure things. So we're in one of these situations where I also don't want the Texans to pass on a quarterback at number 2, and yet the guy who should be on my side keeps using the wrong arguments for it. So there's that. I think as far as the sure thing part of it, yeah, I agree that as I discussed, Will Anderson isn't the sure thing. The part that's very confusing to me, and maybe I've just got some blind spot here, is that somehow passing on a quarterback is the conservative mode. Is that maybe that harkens back to the Patriots being a defensive-minded football team? I don't yet at various times having the most prolific offenses or taking swings at Randy Moss. I don't quite get that, and I don't get Peter King's logic there. I do think, and I'll point out to anybody just joining us, Peter King did say he's 90% certain that the Texans are going to take a quarterback. A lot of what Peter King said has really been chopped up and spit out, like the way they presented it to Shannon Sharpe here. I might have called him Shannon King a couple times because I have one of my wife's friends' name is Shannon King, but Shannon Sharpe is kind of running with what they fed him here, which isn't actually what Peter King said.
Jacksonville says, please take Will Anderson.
Yeah, right. Well, there you go.
Okay, that a good point there too is like, okay, I always try to do this. Like if you're game planning, if you're trying to figure out, maybe what the best course of action is in any competition or in the draft, like, well, yeah, what would my opponents really not want me to do? Would my opponents want me? Would my opponents be more scared of me drafting C.J. Stroud, or would my opponents be more scared of me drafting Will Anderson or Tyree Wilson? I've got a pretty good feeling. Again, people in this division have watched the Texans be very competitive at times with J.J. Watt and with Jadeveon Clowney or other very good defensive players, but knowing that ultimately that's not how you get to the top. If you had J.J. Watt and a quarterback who is better than Brock Osweiler, well, then we're cooking. So I'd rather get the quarterback who's better than Brock Osweiler right now, and then worry about the edge rusher, maybe at number 12 or beyond. It's funny because, okay, you've got a Deshaun Watson as a 12th overall pick. You've got a J.J. Watt as an 11th overall pick. The Texans have this overall pick at number 12. And I don't want to play that game where you say, hey, you can get anybody at any spot. But there is a little bit of symmetry there that you got to acknowledge, that if the Texans are going to go after a really good defensive player, to think that you can't get that guy at 12, especially given the way things are shaking out this year, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. We're going to get to Chris Mortensen here. And Chris Mortensen, in his assertion, he dials it back a little bit here. I want you to watch when he first tells these guys that they need to adjust their mock drafts, Mel Kiper and Todd McShay. He dials it back after a little bit, but there's a couple things about this that don't really make sense.
Phil, what I'm hearing is that both Mel and Todd are going to have to change their mock drafts. Ooh. And that Bryce Young is the pick And yes, connecting Frank Wright to C.J. Stroud in terms of the prototype of guy that he's worked with in the past. But they all love Bryce Young.
Okay, and this is where and frankly, it's hard, and Chris Mortensen, if you didn't know, he had mouth cancer, or throat cancer, so that's where his speech is a little different than it used to be. But I'm trying to figure out at this stage, a couple weeks before the draft, which organization would have multiple people telling a reporter, "Oh yeah, this is the guy. It's the guy we're going for," unless they're trying to keep interest alive in a potential trade. And that's when you ask, okay, what's the most likely scenario? Is the most likely scenario that multiple people are telling Chris Mortensen, the guy that they're absolutely in love with, and that's who they're going to take? Or is it more likely that maybe they're telling him that, but it's not completely genuine, or it doesn't tell the whole picture? Because I think it's very possible that they really do like Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud alike, and they're like I am right now. I think I like Bryce Young better in almost every category, except I'm terrified about his size, and not just because of injury, but I do wonder. It's not so simple to say, hey, because he was good over the middle in the SEC, that he's going to be good over the middle in the NFL. I digress. But it just doesn't make sense that multiple people, and the only two people that really matter are Fitterer, the GM, and Frank Reich. Those are the two guys that maybe know for sure who they're drafting, but also maybe I would want the Texans to perhaps put out some feelers about trading up. Like there's just too much gamesmanship that's going on, and I guess that would be my other big objection to the Texans not drafting a quarterback at number 2 right now is simply that my NFLPA. I get an NFLPA life tip on Fridays, so. It's simply that D'Amico Ryans has strongly hinted that the Texans are going to take a quarterback. Cal and Hannah McNair strongly hinted that the Texans are going to take a quarterback. And I don't think the Texans are in a position where they should or would be toying with the fans' emotions like that. There's a time for gamesmanship, but for the Texans right now, this really isn't a great position for gamesmanship to begin with. But also, I don't think that they necessarily want to be messing around with that stuff. When it comes to fans' emotions and a quarterback, if they were completely quiet and didn't say a thing about it, well, that's one tactic. And at least then that's respecting the emotions of your fans. I'd be surprised if they would do that. The other thing, too, is that when the team is going to do something that is going to fly in the face of what people's expectations are, or that they think might be really, really unpopular. I should say when teams in general do this, there's usually hints given. There's usually people in the media kind of get a feel for like, you feel like the team is trying to give you hints to temper fans' expectations or to present things as possibilities. Now, is it possible that, either Lance or other people have been fed those things? That's possible. Personally, in the past, in situations like this, I feel like I would have gotten a tip. Not an outright tip, but at least something like, you never know. You just never know. And I don't get that feel right now. So it's, who knows who's hearing anything from whom, but I'm not buying that part of it right this moment. Okay, so Todd McShay addresses the part about how Frank Reich has always worked with prototype quarterbacks in the past.
I'll say this too, we always focus on Frank Reich and what he's worked with. First of all, he didn't draft any of those guys that he worked with. Second of all, Scott Fitterer, the general manager, was with Seattle when they drafted Russell Wilson, albeit in the 3rd round, but just over 5'10". He would get sturdier build, but it was a risk at that point, and we saw how it paid off.
Yeah, so I think between Fitterer and Frank Reich, a couple of parts of that argument have never made sense to me. About Frank Reich has always worked with prototype quarterbacks. There are very, very few quarterbacks in the NFL who are 6'2" and under. One of them is on the Texans roster right now in Case Keenum, or who are shorter than 6'2". It's very uncommon. I get the feeling that people think it's more common than it is because there's some notable ones out there. But Frank Reich as McShay said, didn't draft those quarterbacks. Even if he had drafted them, most good quarterback prospects tend to be 6'3" or taller. And then also by the same token, various other quarterback coaches who haven't worked with short quarterbacks before, or GMs who haven't end up drafting a Russell Wilson or a Drew Brees or whatever. So I'm not buying that as an objection to it. It's got a little bit spicy here at the end of Mortensen's appearance because Chris Mortensen had an issue with the way that Mel Kiper framed his statement.
And what Mort's saying is the decision's been made as Bryce Young. We'll see. We got a long way to go till the end of April. A lot of things to be done.
First of all, I didn't say the decision has been made. So, because we still have time. But, all right, but listen, as far as Bryce Young, listen, his size is absolutely the one red flag on him. Otherwise, listen, this is a guy who is magic, like I've heard Todd say. Steph Curry is a comparison. And oh, by the way, it's kind of somebody who was Bryce Young's idol. He's a point guard. He is by far the best processor in this draft.
Okay, as far as the Steph Curry comparisons and everything, that's a whole nother discussion. I hate to do this because now I've sided with Skip Bayless at least once because Bayless recognized that Peter King was speculating, and yet said he was probably speculating with knowledge. I feel like Peter King was pretty honest and open about that knowledge, that he was saying people he knows that know Caserio think he might do this if. But also now I have to side with Mel Kiper. I mean, Mortensen phrased that like the Panthers are taking Bryce Young. So I'm not quite sure about that. I did find this after I'd compiled all the other stuff. Peter King on his podcast elucidating his comments from Monday morning quarterback. And first talking about what he thinks the Carolina Panthers might do.
Definitely people inside that organization who love Bryce Young. I mean, love Bryce Young. And so as I look at this right now, I think that before, when I talked about head coach Frank Reich and his love of large, tall quarterbacks, I have basically talked myself into CJ Stroud for the first pick. But I was told by a couple of people, not so fast, and I think that is where I sit right now. Josh McCown, the quarterback coach of the Carolina Panthers, before he took this job, he had told someone else in the league that he absolutely loves Bryce Young, and you don't see size when you see Bryce Young. So that's one thing that kind of started to make me think a little bit.
Okay, so it's funny. I know I see a lot of people saying like, okay, mock drafts are garbage and all this. Yeah, I mean, they are. There's a lot of just blatant clickbait where people are they're going to switch their mock drafts up because they get more clicks every time they do it. It's notable to me when Peter King or Chris Mortensen chime in because they're not opinion givers as much. I know Peter King is maybe morphed more into that. But they've got that reporting background to where they're being open about speculation, but they're also basing it on things that they hear. I think that both of what those guys are saying right now, because I've seen both sides of this, three sides of it really as a player also, but on the media, I've seen both sides of it from the team's perspective. I think Peter King keeps framing this as people he knows who know people with the Texans think this. And a lot of it really does come down to sometimes the national writers, when they're talking to local people, kind of, I think, give a little too much credence to the local person's opinion. I've been quoted by national writers at times and thought to myself, well, it's sure. I mean, I guess when taken literally, it looks like I maybe was super, super confident in what I was telling this guy, but really I was speculating too. So there's a little bit of the telephone game that goes on there, because everything that Peter King has said, I do see as plausible. I just don't see it as likely given all the other things that we know locally. I think the Texans are going to take a quarterback. all the tea leaves, and we'll hear these guys talk multiple times about tea leaves. Or Shannon and Skip did when I didn't include those clips. That it's not all the other tea leaves that we're privy to. It doesn't seem that way. I'm including you guys. Like you guys are way on top of this. These guys have to cover 32 teams. You guys are on top of this day in and day out. And I know there's a healthy portion of Texans fans who do think it would be cool or wise to pass on a quarterback. I disagree, and I'm just not. And I do believe that if they were to pass on a quarterback, I'd be surprised if it was Will Anderson as the choice that they took.
So let's go to number 2, because we can sort of go around for a long time about the Panthers. The fact is, I don't know who they're picking. They're going to pick one of those 2 quarterbacks. So let's move on. So I heard 2 very interesting things last week. One is that Nick Caserio, the general manager of the Houston Texans, picking 2nd in this draft, does not feel like he is forced into taking a quarterback number 2. And the reason is he's got 2 number 1 picks next year, and he's got the 13th pick this year, as well as this 2nd pick. So as this person, is this person,
sorry.
Yes, that's right. So let's just clarify that. He's got the 2nd pick and the 13th pick this year. Next year, he has his own pick and another number 1 from the Cleveland Browns.
Yep.
So with all of that draft capital, I was told that Nick Caserio does not feel forced if there's a quarterback at number 2 who he doesn't love. He doesn't feel forced to have to pick a quarterback, and he could then take the safest player by far in this draft, Will Anderson.
Okay, all right, and this is where I start to go crazy a little bit because where are the Texans picking right now? They're picking number 2 overall, right? Okay, so you might love Caleb Williams. You might have all the draft capital in the freaking world. There's a chance there'll be 1 or 2 teams above you next year that love him also. This notion that, somehow, hey, Nick Caserio's got to draft a quarterback. Oh, my God. It's the end of the world if he doesn't draft a quarterback. And yet at the same time, we'll just wait and see what happens next year. We got all those draft capital, baby. If a team that needs a quarterback is number 1 overall next year, then the Texans aren't going to be able to trade up. They could have 4 first-round picks. They're not going to be able to trade up into number 1 overall if Caleb Williams ends up being as good a prospect as they think they are. And I think that's another thing that we do and make a lot of mistakes with is when we take how we feel about the quarterbacks right now and assume that, oh yeah, just extrapolate that line upward and they're all going to be awesome next year. It doesn't always work out that way. I would say more often than not, it does not work out that way. That was the other issue that I had with Shannon Sharpe also. And when it comes to the whole tanking side of things was the him acting like it's ridiculous that they would have hired and fired David Culley, and yet at the same time, also absurd that they didn't tank at the very end of the season. Like everybody wants to have their cake and eat it too when it comes to bashing the Texans. They want Nick Caserio to draft a quarterback now, but also, oh, he's an idiot if he doesn't wait because he's got plenty of time in the future. I know I'm Venn diagramming there in a bad way, but one more from Peter King here.
Everybody, when I wrote this in my column, I got this, oh, you're out of your mind. You're doing the Texans bidding. You're doing this. But so another person with knowledge of people inside the Texans also told me the other day that they would really like to have Bryce Young as their pick. They're hoping that it's CJ Stroud at number 1 and Bryce Young at number 2 because right now they are a little hesitant with CJ Stroud because he's represented by David Mulugeta, who was the agent for Deshaun Watson. And that to me is a little bit of a straw man argument I don't necessarily buy it.
Okay, and this is a classic situation where I think two things can be true, or at least partly true, which is one.
Peter King reports the Texans are.
Jesus. One, that they can really love Bryce Young, and that is true, and that they might really want Bryce Young. I'm a person with knowledge of the Texans and the way they operate, and I believe that Bryce Young is the apple of their eye, and yet I also know there's a lot of things I don't know, and that the GM and the head coach typically do a pretty good job of keeping it extremely quiet. They're not generally out at bars blabbing to even their buddies or anything about who they really like and who they're going to take. Everybody's very taciturn when it comes to this stuff. Two, is that yes, it's possible that the Texans prefer not to deal with Mulligetta, and yet that doesn't mean that it's prohibitive. Or that's the dividing line between which prospects they like or don't like. I highly, highly doubt that Mulligetta would be the deciding factor into whether they want Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. I also think that the Mulligetta stuff, it's hard when you start reporting on people's emotions or people's feelings. Teams in general work with a lot of agents that they really don't like and that they might not prefer to do business with, and yet the client they want, the athlete they want, is represented by that agent. The other thing too, and I know I told you guys before this before, is that look, the agent works for the client. If Deshaun Watson, this was not planted in Deshaun Watson's head to get himself into a big pickle while simultaneously wanting to get the hell out of town. Mulligetta did a hell of a job in doing his bidding, and at least by Deshaun's standards, not a hell of a job by our perspective. So I don't buy that. I'm with like Peter King there, whether it's a straw man argument or a red herring or whatever it might be. I'm not buying that part of it. So as it stands right now, I very much expect the Texans to draft a quarterback with number 2 overall. I've been ignoring some of these questions, everybody. I apologize because I've been promising my wife that I'm going to spend a half hour on these things, and then I also and then I fail. Mr. Robot says completely correct. Shannon is saying Caserio basically can't afford to be cute with this pick. I was agreeing with Shannon on that. I'm just not mad at Caserio as if it already happened. If some idiot grabs Levis and AR-15 in the top 12, we are guaranteed a good player at 12. I am, as far as whether or not that's an idiotic move, I'm not completely enamored of the guys that are going to be around at the 12th pick. Most likely, I do like a lot of these offensive linemen, and I just don't think unless they take a center way too high, I don't think it's going to be an offensive lineman. So Kenyon Green's really got to get his act together this year. I'm just picking these at random, everybody, by the way. It's not a meritocracy. Luke says, why does anyone pay attention to mock drafts? I don't know. Anyone that can see into the future, do you? As far as Shannon, that dude's always shooting his mouth off without thinking. As far as the mock drafts go, you know what they are good for is, for one, I mean, it's like picking a bracket in the NCAAs. There's just too many permutations for people to really nail it. Although guys will brag when they do nail it. I think the biggest thing is when it comes to who's getting drafted in the first round, who's getting drafted in the second round, and generally where in the draft, there are some definite trends to that, and there's some predictability. So when, like with the Raiders, it's instructive to look at the Raiders when they had those several years where it looked like they were completely reaching for the Clelin Ferrells and the like. In any one given draft, you can't say like, all right, wow, they reached for that. What an idiot. That guy would have been available 30 picks later. You can't say that on a case-by-case basis. There might be 4 teams that really love that guy and we're going to draft that guy at that moment. But when you start to see it over time as a trend, that's notable because the mock drafts over time do a pretty good job of showing guys that are going to go in the top 15, guys that are going to be in the first round, guys that'll be second through fourth round, all of that. But you're right, like to take it as, like literal truth and be crushing your GM because he drafted some guy that was definitely going to be available later. That's that's a little bit presumptuous. Let's see. Mike's book reviews. Mike does like the fantasy genre book reviews. And I'm not into the fantasy genre, but I know Mike a little bit just from him being a Texans fan for so long. So if you're into the fantasy book genre, I would say follow Mike's book reviews. And he said ever since the Mario picked the national pundits, always expect Houston to do something wild in the draft. Yeah. And you're generally told about those things not too far in advance. All right, these last two, because somebody said he agreed with Mr. Robot. He said, no, they don't need everything. Free agency has the Texans sitting pretty good in many positions. Plus, that's what the other 10 draft picks are for. Plus, next year's, yes, this is the year to go QB. Jake Wood agrees with Mr. Robot. I tend to agree as well. And I'm like, I try not to get too wrapped up and worked up about it. But this year, between having the number 2 overall and the number 12 overall, and now with Hendon Hooker starting to come on strong at the end, surpass Will Levis and Anthony Richardson in some people's minds, it's getting super, super interesting. And ultimately, I still respect Peter King. I still respect Chris Mortensen, although I'm most skeptical of his confidence with which he's saying CJ Stroud will be taken. But I do think Peter King has been taken out of context a little bit. So I will not disparage his good name. Thank you, everybody. I will try to put out something this weekend in terms of a couple of prospect reviews, guys that you might take as defensive edge rushers or interior rushers. Subscribe, like, pass it on, share, all that. Thank you, everybody.